Okay, so this is take like 10 probably. Um, I have been kicking around the idea of making a YouTube video about politics for a while, and I got sent this article um, that has some, I think, pretty bad takes that I want to pick apart for a little bit of practice and for fun. So let's jump right in. Andrew Sullivan's article, Why Wokeness is Winning, is it's basically reactionary scaremongering that creates a straw version of the left, full of obfuscation and outright intellectual dishonesty. Um, his opening statement here um, amounts to critical theory bad and is taking over our institutions somehow. This is inaccurate, but attempts to persuade its readers by failing, I suspect intentionally, to define its terms and paints with a very broad and meandering brush. It's difficult to engage with Sullivan's article without seeming uncharitable or like I'm putting words in his mouth, but it's due to a lack of clear explanation. He does not draw accurate borders around his topics. The title of the article, for example, implies that this is a critique of wokeness, but the article introduces a critique of critical race theory, almost immediately conflating the two. The definition he offers for critical race theory seems to include critical race theory as part of itself. So either he's critiquing wokeness but doesn't clearly establish it, or he's critiquing critical race theory but defines it using itself plus a bunch of other loosely related ideas. So, section 1. Define your terms, Andrew. I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but every time I look at this quote he borrows from Barry Weiss, it really just rubs me the wrong way and just tilts the absolute fuck out of me. It's a jargon-laden mess that confuses more than it defines, and since neither Andy or Barry care to give us working definitions, let's rapid fire some real basic easy definitions so we can get on the same page. Let's start with the title, not contained within this. Woke or stay woke comes from an American dialect of English, African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, popularized in the early the not the dialect, but the term "stay woke" was popularized in the early 2010s. It's essentially calling on others to be conscientious of social injustice, especially but not limited to race. Real basically, it's a casual reminder to look for the deeper roots of the deeper root causes of social issues. It's become associated a lot with left-wing politics over the years. Next is critical theory, which is a broad academic discipline overlapping with various humanities and social sciences, philosophy, sociology. Um, it seeks to examine the structures of society, culture, and institutions. Critical theory is less concerned with individuals and more with systems. It has historical connections to Karl Marx and Marxist thinking, but critical theory should be thought of as an umbrella term that contains Marxism as a a small piece of it, and critical race theory specifically is a school within critical theory that focuses on structural causes of racism. Postmodernism is a sprawling school of thought which can be difficult to define succinctly, but very basically, it's a skepticism about meta narratives. It understands knowledge and truth as socially constructed, created, and influenced by power. Post-colonialism is a way of doing history that is concerned with, well, the legacy of colonialism, and how the perspectives of colonized people were and continue to be pushed to the margins. Identity politics is a method of political organizing and coalition building around politically defined or politically significant identities, race, gender, sexual orientation. Um, the term has become kind of muddled in recent years and tends to describe any political movement or issue that centers in some way around identity. It has picked up a lot of negative connotations in the popular consciousness, in part due to the wholesale rejection of it by the right and a lot of internal debate about its uses and efficacy on the left. Identity politics also tends to be at odds with postmodernism, since postmodernism seeks to interrogate why these distinctions exist in the first place, whereas identity politics seeks to use them to organize around. Um, Neo-Marxism is Marxism plus later schools of thought in lineage to Karl Marx. Um, Sometimes these newer schools of thinking are at odds with classical Marxist thinking, and Marxism is a modernist philosophy that understands social conflict through the lens of class struggle, which is a meta narrative that postmodernism would be at odds with, and in a way, it can be at odds with identity politics since it's primarily concerned with class, and certain Marxist frameworks don't feel that it's important to draw these additional distinctions as they divide the working class against the owning class. Intersectionality is a technique within critical theory. It's more of a style that focuses on the combinations and overlaps of different political identities. It complicates traditional identity politics and only fits within some Marxist frameworks. Um, Again, it's more of a style and less of its own coherent ideology. Same kind of thing with therapeutic mentality. So far as I can tell, it's another style, focusing on care and subjective experience for individual needs, which, as you might guess, is going to be at odds with critical theory, which focuses on systems and structures and not so much on the subjective needs of individuals. So, in short, I've just wasted like 5 minutes giving a bunch of definitions for incompatible jargon that Sullivan chooses not to elaborate on. I suspect because doing so would highlight the contradictions. This is also why he lists so many different institutions supposedly affected by maybe critical theory or maybe wokeness, and then gives this confusing definition. Most people are going to be familiar with some of these concepts and all of these institutions, and you may be able to pick out the parts that you're familiar with within some of these institutions. And if you trust Sullivan as our narrator, then you're going to assume that because he's right about the ones you're familiar with, he's right about the rest of it. This is a rhetorical sleight of hand. Um, this alone should be enough to cast some doubt on Sullivan's writings, uh, with being built on such a shaky foundation, but I'm going to continue to go through and demonstrate a lot of the other problems with it. Section 2. Do you want to build a straw man? So, as I have demonstrated, Sullivan lays out such broad definitions of his opponents that almost anything about race that he doesn't like from almost any source could be seen as supporting evidence for his claim. And let's look at what he does with this wide latitude he's given himself. One of the first pieces of evidence he discusses is about the SATs. He talks about how colleges are dropping the SATs and that the wokes are claiming that merit is a racist idea. His evidence for this is a tweet. So his evidence for it here is this tweet with 34 likes, or maybe this section of the tweet with 63 likes, from this woman who has like 3,500 followers. Uh, I guess, how is liberal democracy going to survive Twitter woman with 3,500 followers? Um, cool. This kind of straw manning is everywhere, dropping an unrepresentative example with no discussion of the actual critical thinking behind it, and then he kind of just lets it hang, as though pointing at it with an embedded Twitter link proves something. I feel like wasting more of my time, so let's take a brief tangent to touch on some of the actual theory and history and discourse because it's pretty interesting. The tweet he links to has another link to an academic paper here. Hiding behind high stakes testing, meritocracy, objectivity, and inequality in the U.S. education system. Or, sorry, inequity in U.S. education. So this paper discusses some pretty interesting things, actually. The roots of it traces the roots of intelligence testing, going back to the early 1900s with Alfred Binet developing an early IQ test to benchmark young school children for the purposes of providing extra support to those who are underperforming. His testing methods were later co-opted and popularized by eugenicists and race scientists. The paper traces how this racism was baked into the foundation of IQ testing and later intelligence testing, leading on to standardized testing, and how standardized testing came to overtake the United States school systems, carrying with it the unintended consequences of its eugenicist legacy. It's actually pretty interesting, and I wish Sullivan would just discuss this article. Like, if he wants to prove his point, why not engage with the actual theory? Of course, Sullivan does not engage with this, does not summarize this argument, does not attempt to refute it. He just points at a barely seen tweet on the topic and pretends this is the monolithic representation of the woke take and the deep end of thought on the subject. He points to a tweet tweeting the article. He abstracts from the article itself. So this actually leads me to another quick tangent that I think will be important to keep in mind going forward. Wokeness is colloquial and critical race theory is academic, and pretending that the two of them are the same thing is disingenuous. Wokeness is informal and seeks to create pithy synthesizations or syntheses of less accessible theory. So when this person tweets that merit is racist and cites this paper, it's a soundbite version of a much more complex issue. Sullivan is muddying the issue so that it looks like the academic argument amounts to the content of the woke tweet. So Sullivan's next point is about the Smithsonian, and his statement on it isn't supported by his own sources. He says the Smithsonian-backed idea that working hard, showing up on time, and perfecting the tasks are functions of whiteness. Sullivan's implying here, I think, that the wokes have made the Smithsonian be racist in an attempt to not be racist. The controversy he's citing stemmed from an infographic that was originally included in the Smithsonian's article on the concept of whiteness. The infographic received immediate backlash and was removed seemingly within a day. From what I'm able to piece together, the infographic was trying to express that values of working hard, showing up on time, and perfecting a task are values that are contained within white culture, but were understood by some readers as being ascribed as essential qualities of white people. And to avoid confusion, the Smithsonian apologized and removed the infographic. And you can see here on the screen their statement on it. You can pause and read it if you'd like. So to recap, the problem was the infographic inside of a much larger piece of work that was immediately retracted after being criticized. I mean, I guess this is how wokeness is destroying Western civilization. Come on, Andy. This is trite, and you didn't even read your own sources, or you're just not being honest with us. Let's skip ahead a little to this piece about corporations who haven't publicly committed themselves to the full woke project are being hounded by their employees into doing so, meaning hiring and firing based on race and forcing employees into re-education sessions guided by D'Angelo and Kendi. Once again, the sources don't back up the claim. Neither article discusses hiring or firing on the basis of race, the introduction of any new training, or anything at all to do with D'Angelo or Kendi. The first article, Hounded, links to this article here about Joe Rogan and Spotify. So Joe Rogan is a podcaster on Spotify. Or rather, he's a podcaster who has recently joined Spotify as a platform. Spotify is a company of about 4,400 employees, and the article discusses how some staffers are upset about some of the content in Joe Rogan's podcast that they're putting on the platform that they work for. They had about 10 meetings about it across, again, a company of 4,400 employees, and the CEO stepped in and said, "We're not doing anything here." That's it. The second article is about a company, Coinbase, with about 1,125 employees, had an unknown number of employees stage a walkout in protest of the CEO not verbally supporting Black Lives Matter. It looks like the company basically just requested that everyone stop talking about politics, and the article seems to imply that maybe some packages were offered some severance packages were offered to employees who chose not to stay with the company following this. Um, Hardly the pervasive society reshaping nightmare that Sullivan wants to paint the wokes as. This amounts to two different internal controversies at medium to large size companies, which didn't result in any kind of major shakeup. What fresh hell is next? I'm being dramatic. I already know. I read the article, and this one is actually one of my favorites because it's just so hilariously wrong and dishonest. The NBA, for Pete's sake, is now a festival of wokeness, even as viewership collapses. Um, just there's so much wrong with this. So the Festival of Wokeness article here um, is not at all what the article is saying. The article is written by some transphobic dickhead accusing the NBA of not actually being that woke because they cater to the sensibilities of the Chinese government in order to secure profits. I call the author a transphobic dickhead because he's mad about the NBA relocating their 2017 All-Star game after North Carolina passed a bathroom bill that would require trans people to use the bathroom based on their gender assigned at birth rather than their current gender identity. This is an entire other rabbit hole that I really don't have time to explore in the depth that it deserves. But what's important for our purposes is that Sullivan uses this article to claim that the NBA is too woke, but the article itself is arguing that they aren't as woke as they look. Sullivan's immediate follow-up is talking about how even as viewership collapses, which seems to imply a causal relationship that the wokeness of the NBA is what's causing the collapse in viewership. Except that's not what the article he cites says. Broader trends in entertainment consumption, including consumers canceling cable TV subscriptions and watching more on-demand content on Netflix and other services, are likely playing a larger role. It goes on to say the rise of social justice protests seem to have had little effect on sports TV viewing. Other sports with fewer protests saw declines in viewers. The National Hockey League Stanley Cup saw a 61% drop. It's almost like COVID and the 2020 election and major changes to the media landscape are the culprit, Andrew. I do want to acknowledge that I skipped over his point about the California ballot initiative, the leadership hiring mandate, and I don't plan to spend much time on his comments on the 1619 project, as again, these are pretty deep rabbit holes I don't have the time to explore in the depth they deserve. But real quick, Prop 16 passing would essentially allow for affirmative action. The argument against affirmative action tends to be that things are fair enough, it's just reverse discrimination, and you should have to earn your spot based on merit. The argument for affirmative action tends to be that if we accept all people are created equal, we should expect that at all levels of society it's a representative cross section of the community, and if that's not happening, we should help that happen. In the interest of transparency, I do tend to believe the latter, but since this isn't my focus, I don't want to dwell on this too much, and I don't really want to even push my own value judgment on it too hard right at the moment. Okay, back to being a snarky dick to Andy. And the piece de resistance, 21% of liberal students in Ivy League colleges 21% of liberal students in the Ivy League favor some level of violence to stop campus speech they disapprove of. So here's the article, and if you've been paying attention, surprise, surprise, it doesn't say what Andy implies it says. The article does not say 21%, rather, the 21% breaks down as following. 1% say violence is always acceptable, 3% say sometimes, 17% say rarely. I don't actually think it's fair to characterize 17% of people saying in rare cases violence is okay as favor some level of violence, but saying between 1 and 4% won't sound as spooky to his readers. Also, the article does not say that 21% were liberal or left-leaning. Sullivan is inferring this from an earlier paragraph in the article here, which talks about how Democrats were less likely to support Trump coming to campus than Republicans were to support Biden coming to campus. I would also note that Trump has a history of making inflammatory statements towards minorities, women, and he tends to cozy up to white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys, which should understandably make women and minorities shall we say, uncomfortable inviting that into their place of work and living. This whole section culminates into a line that like almost transcends into satirical high art. Um, there seems to be no stopping this. But why? Why this powerful, seemingly inevitable shift, especially among white elites? No stopping it. No stopping it. Except for when it stops itself, like the Smithsonian, and then issues a retraction, or when the boss of the Unstoppable Woke says, "Okay, guys, 10 meetings is enough. We're not censoring Joe's podcast." A shift among powerful elites, like the Twitter woman with 3,500 followers, some random people working at Coinbase or the NBA who apparently aren't that woke and are hemorrhaging viewership because of social unrest and a shifting media landscape. Or what, the college Democrats? Andy, Andy, are you okay? Are you okay, dude? Did a college basketball team make fun of you on Twitter and then steal all your fucking Bitcoin? So the only real levers of power that get referenced in this whole rambling section are the California ballot measures. And I guess I didn't realize that contested votes in California are the litmus test for the desires of the powerful elites. He goes on to say he'd posit that the reasons for this are a rough guess, and that he hopes we can start a conversation for these astonishing changes and how to engage with it. I mean, except he very clearly doesn't. Um, or you wouldn't have opened your article by dismissing an entire academic discipline as postmodern claptrap and then proceed to misrepresent it to your audience. If you wanted to have an honest conversation, we could spend some time talking about the more substantial issues that you reference, misrepresent, and then fly past. A conversation about the social construction of race, or maybe the history and legacy of intelligence testing, how to draw a line between free expression and hate speech, or perhaps the prison industrial complex and the police. We can put a pin in that one, because I know what comes next. Section 3. But why, though? Um, Sullivan's next section asks why the wokes, who he has failed to properly define or demonstrate are actually taking anything over, but are definitely taking anything over, have become so prevalent. So his first reason is emotion, which, while there's some truth to there being an emotional component to any political movement, being raised as the first and one of the primary issues strikes of an attempt at a soft denial of the underlying rationale of critical race theory by trying to position emotional response as a core source of this. He continues that he continues to talk a little bit about reform and changes to policing as an institution and how they have bipartisan support, even though the current people in charge seem to have no interest in making major reforms. And then he goes on to misrepresent the Black Lives Matter movement, talking about how they don't want to reform the police, they want to just get rid of them, and they think all cops are bastards and justify violence. And again, he doesn't actually dig into what the other side is saying. He just constructs a straw man. So, abolish the police and the term ACAB, or all cops are bastards, that he's referencing, are heavily linked to protest and activism. They're emphatic, pithy statements to summarize very complicated ideas so they can be shouted at public demonstrations. They are not the full depth of theory on the subject. Other related concepts to abolish the police are, defunding or unbundling the police. This would be a major reshaping and rethinking of how policing is handled, broadening it to community and public safety and well-being rather than just policing. These movements seek to address problems like the lack of training for police officers and how the little training that they do get doesn't really prepare them for their actual responsibilities, the lack of accountability for officers who act outside of the public interest, including things like qualified immunity, and the lack of any central licensing for police that allows bad cops to jump from department to department. The existence of white supremacist gangs embedded into some police departments around the United States, officers policing neighborhoods that they don't live in or feel connections to, police budgets being supplemented by tickets and civil asset forfeiture, which creates incentives for police to over-ticket and seize property, and the disturbing prevalence of police officers killing or brutalizing people, especially black folks. People might understandably feel some contempt towards this job that exists in our society, hence ACAB. Not a judgment necessarily on the essential characteristics of the individual officers, but a visceral rebuke of the institution of policing that pushes individuals to become this. The level of reshaping needed could reasonably said to go beyond the scope of simple reform, hence abolition of the institution of policing, and very important, and replacing it with a wide array of accountable, specialized public services. Again, Sullivan does not engage with this even slightly. He continues on to talk about how critical race theory has constructed a crude moral binary to pressure liberals into submission, where neutrality and doubt and indifference are not allowed. I didn't realize neutrality and doubt and indifference are liberal values, but okay. Um, and he goes on to pretend like being called a racist is such a terrifying thing that people would sell out their core values to avoid people on Twitter calling them racists. Critical theory aims to understand the structure of society and how it could be improved. It does have the apparently controversial premise that racism is bad, um, but it requires analysis and argument about the sources and remedies to racism. There's a lot of room for debate and discussion within this framework. Is Sullivan asserting that racism bad is not compatible with liberal values, or that liberalism should seek for eternal neutrality and doubt? His second reason for why critical race theory has become so prevalent is that it's easy, which is weird because I could have sworn that it was a bunch of esoteric academia that you defined using a bunch of jargon. Um, he goes on to talk about how social inequities are extremely complicated things and a huge variety of factors may play in. I mean, having multifactorial causes, though, is entirely consistent with critical theory. He gives as examples of the huge variety of factors class, family structure, education, neighborhood, sex, biology, genetics, and culture. Let me read that again. A huge variety of factors may be in play class, family structure, education, neighborhood, sex, biology, genetics, and culture. We've been talking a lot in this essay about race, but it's somehow absent from his list of multifactorial causes for social inequities. Um, so I'm going to explicitly address that because he chooses not to. Um, if you're black in America, then on aggregate, that's also going to be connected to your social class, your family structure, your education, your neighborhood, and your culture. Why? Not because of essential characteristics of being black or being a black person, but because of the history of the systems and structures in America. Slavery and Jim Crow preventing generations upon generations of black folks from acquiring generational wealth and consigning black people to worse neighborhoods, worse schools with less economic opportunity, facing greater policing and higher rates of incarceration, damaging family structures in those communities. I mean, and this is structural racism. It overlaps with many of the complexities that Sullivan pretends it leaves out. This is an insight of critical race theory. Things that we like to frame as individual and disconnected are often connected in interesting and unexpected ways to larger structures in our society. Intersectionality is, in part, the practice of applying these different variables to understand the ways that different people struggle and their different needs that they have. Systemic racism may be a simple couple of words to say, but it's complicated to explain, and the type of analysis it does offer is pretty nuanced. Um, Sullivan doesn't offer any of his own examples beyond just saying, look, it's complicated, and critical race theory does not address these things, except it does. I also need to talk about his mention of biology and genetics. I looked up Sullivan, and part of his journalistic legacy was to help popularize The Bell Curve, a race science book from the 90s, which uses bad science to suggest that racial and ethnic minorities are genetically inferior. So Andy calling out these elements in this context is raising some red flags for me. Um, the nearest we get to agreeing on something actually comes a bit later. So he talks about how social aspirations play a role here, and this actually hits on something that's become an increasing internal debate on the left, that there are concerns in left-wing spaces about some people adopting performative social justice as a part of a personal brand to accrue social capital instead of making meaningful intellectual contributions or advocating for change for a more just world. The causes and remedies are still being explored, and Sullivan's interest here is really just to dismiss the entire school of thought as some kind of social clout game. So he goes on to say that what's making critical race theory so successful is its ruthlessness, um, and talks about how people who view the world only as a power struggle have no qualms exercising it, and under critical race theory, that payback is fair play. I mean, so this immediately points to another problem. So, Andrew, does identity have primacy here, or is it all about power? Is it identity politics, or is it postmodernism? It's almost like you're conflating a bunch of different schools of thought. So this is quite a logical leap that looking at society through the lens of power would prime you to senselessly exercise it against others. I mean, and again, I'm gonna need Andrew to show me what part of critical theory advocates for payback. And, you know, tweets with half a dozen likes don't count as theory, by the way. I mean, Sullivan basically concludes his piece by whining that Wes Yang won't debate him, despite being a very smart logic boy who definitely reads all of his journalisms that he links to on his blog. Conclusion. Let me out. Um, so we need to talk about what this article is actually doing. Um, it does not take a deep dive into any particular part of the theory it seeks to dismiss. The whole article amounts to a rhetorical sleight of hand. By quoting incongruous sets of broad ideas, approaches, flattening them into a single cohesive ideology, misrepresenting them to look more dangerous and pervasive than they actually are, and picking these straw man versions of leftist thought to breed contempt and support for to breed contempt towards the left and support for dismissal of these ideas. Um, this whole examination here feels like I've kind of walked into a trap designed to waste my time. It takes a lot of time and effort and knowledge to demonstrate just how flimsy the construction and baselessness of these arguments actually are. Furthermore, a lot is implied rather than outright stated, so Sullivan can always safely retreat by saying I've misrepresented him, while never actually having to get too deep into his own specifics. I think the other point of this essay is as an aesthetic appeal for readers to adopt Andrew's political disposition, um, to appear as calm, rational, classical liberal observers who can objectively judge all ideas. Um, but no ideas have actually been presented here. Only long-winded ramblings against an ill-defined straw man that conflates critical theory and wokeness. This essay is a sad attempt to construct a boogeyman.